Hey Joris, so thanks for taking the time to answer some of my question about Indonesia.
Hmm.
First of all, I want to say thank you very much. I'm a big fan of Splotter, so it's
Thank you.
really cool to have you on. And maybe before we start, maybe can you briefly introduce yourself and what's your working relationship with the designer that you've been working on Indonesia, but also other Splotter games.
Yeah, so I'm Joris Wiersinga. I am one of the founders of Splotter. Splotter Spellen and we are a company in the Netherlands, and we've been making board games for over 20 years, I guess, 25 maybe even. And most of
Yeah, I
those,
was about to say it's a bit more than 20
yeah,
years, but
yeah,
yeah.
25, I think. Most of those I make with Jeroen Douwman, who is also the co-owner of Splotter. In the very beginning, we made some games with other groups of people, but for years and years now, all of our games are by Jeroen Douwman and myself. And we mostly make very heavy strategy games, often with an economic theme, so not so much military, but economic strategy games.
And I was wondering, when did you start thinking about making games? Because it's always something that I'm curious about, because I feel there is a big difference in nature between playing this kind of game and having the weird decision to think, well, you know what? I'm not going to only play them. I'm going to start making them, which is an awful idea. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and it can be a pretty painful process. What gave you that weird idea of start making games?
So I made games already when I was very, very small. I made games in primary school when I was 7 or 8 years old. My very first game was called Job Application. Well, the Dutch name for it, sollicitatie. So it was about having to find a job, having to get your first job, going out and getting I remember the first thing that I thought was relevant to get your job is to have shoes, because otherwise you could not walk on the street. So you first had to get shoes so you could walk on the street, and then after you walk on the street, you go on and go do all the other stuff to get your job. I made that when I was I think 7 or 8 years old. I started making games almost before starting to play them, and I have always done that also in high school. I encountered big strategy board games in high school, many of the Evelyn Hill games, and started making expansions for games. First of all, Talisman, for which I played a lot at the time, and I made the Talisman expansion. That is the first game I tried to get published, but I never heard from the publisher. And then Jeroen and I started making games when we met in university when we were about 19 years old.
Okay, so it's a long relationship.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Jeroen and I met. I'm 1 year. I started studying 1 year earlier than Jeroen. I'm 1 year older. I met him on his introduction week for university, and
Okay.
we bonded over strategies that you can use in Go Bang, uh, the five in a row
Yeah, variant
and
of Go.
to clean up Go.
Yeah. Are you also a Go player?
I know the rules, but I'm very bad at it.
This is what all Go players say.
Yeah.
Each time you ask someone who plays Go if they play Go, it's like, oh, I've been playing only for 20 years. I know the rules. I'm pretty bad at it. It's like
I'm not that good. No.
yeah, it's the classic reply. Because I think in a lot of your games you have this logic of efficient move and tempo.
Mhm.
I'm thinking about the Great Zimbabwe, like doing something at the right time is pretty important.
Yeah.
So I feel like it has some distant similarities with Go, so that's why I was curious about if we were playing Go, yeah, in a way or another. But anyway, the reason I invited you today was to talk about Indonesia. First of all, this channel is dedicated to exploring the relationship between game design and history, and
Hmm.
how games represent history. And you've announced somewhat officially, I think that there is going to be a reprint of
Hmm.
Indonesia,
Yeah,
with
there's
pre-orders coming
happening
in a
soon.
couple of weeks. So
Hmm.
before we talk about the historical background of Indonesia, maybe I wanted to leave you a bit of time to talk a bit about this new edition, what is going to change. I know that there has been a lot of feedbacks from players around maybe the size of some components that don't really fit on the board, things like this. And when I was at Aircon a couple of weeks ago, and I will add some pictures when editing, I saw a group of players playing a big version of Indonesia on a neoprene board where they actually had redone the art for the whole thing to be more playable. They had bigger cards for the corporations and everything. And I was wondering, so what is going to be this reprint, what people can expect? Because I can see that there is a lot of love for the game, but some frustration regarding its functionality. So I was curious about that.
Yeah, there's always all of our games get a lot of attention in terms of people making their own versions, which I always like in the sense that I also did that for many games when I was young because I could not get them or could not afford them, so I made my own versions. We the original plan was to do a straight reprint of Indonesia, obviously with the wooden pieces small rather than big, because that was a mistake in the previous edition where there were super sized wooden meeples. So that was the original idea, and then we got a memo from Joshua Starr from Grand Trunk Games with a whole bunch of suggestions saying, look, I think you can make the game much better if you do this, and this, which was extremely insightful. So I thought, okay, yeah. Now, having read this set of great ideas, we cannot really. I don't really want to make the game exactly the way that it was because there are so many good suggestions in here. Let's do something with it, and some of that bit uses ideas that have been developed in the community. Not everything that the community makes appeals to us, but some of it does. And so there has been a pretty thorough makeover of basically most of the items in the game by Jan Lipinski, the same guy who made the graphics for Horse's Carriage for us. Starting with the board, which has been completely redrawn in a green color style, which fits Indonesia, which is a very green country, and where we have worked on the readability and the iconography. Yannick really wanted to change the script, but I am very fond of the script, so
Mm.
that is staying. Although for the parts that are very important to read, we have a different way of showing that. Then the company deeds will be redone so that it is possible to put items on the board and to have separate company deeds that very clearly show that you use the company deeds both to put on the board and separately to use for your own company. And what we see is that in the first version we had very small deeds that you could easily put on the board, and in the second version we had bigger ones that had a nice map on it. That kind of interferes. Both things are nice to have, but we had one or the other, and we will hopefully have something that works for both in this version. We also worked on all the iconography of all the items because we can now make big cardboard pieces with printing on it, so we can use better iconography for all of the items, which makes I think that more the items nicer and more readable, the produced goods. We can also print on the wooden meeples for the ships, so we hopefully will have ships that are wooden ships with some print on it, so they are more recognizable and easier to use. So basically, more or less everything in the game has been redesigned.
Yeah, it's more than a reprint. Like it feels like a real second edition.
It's a real new edition, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And we do not normally do that, but again, because Joshua from Joshua Star sent us this set of really nice ideas. What he did is he evaluated all the stuff that he could find on the community pages, and then
Mm.
looked at why do people do this, and what is the need behind it, and and what would be the best way, and what are the pros and cons of everything. So I'm like, okay, that's a really nice way to look at the UX of a game.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I would say I like the not always UX friendly versions of your games. Like I have the original version of Bus, and I would never change it for the new version. I like its unique art style and some weirdness of it. I think it's really awesome.
Yeah,
Uh,
I also have, I also like that, and certainly for Bus, which was drawn by Tamaha, my girlfriend at the time, and it has a kind of naivete which is very nice. And I think the new edition of Bus is much more readable and easy to use, but it does lose some of that
yeah,
charm. And to a degree, we try to avoid that in this new version of Indonesia, but it might still be there, because the old version of Indonesia was made by Inze, who's made a lot the graphics for lots of our games,
yeah,
and he is really a conceptual artist. So he goes with a concept and then he goes extremely far into making it fit into that concept, and it leads to the funny situation that we get graphics designers looking at our games going like, whoa, this is such a special way of doing things. And we have gamers look at the game and say, oh, this is so ugly, why do they make it look like a prototype?
yeah. I think there is a well, tastes, colors, like this. I know that I really like the some of, as you say, the naivety of some of the designs, some of the uniqueness. Like for example, Can I think is I love the drawings. I love the cardboard cigars and everything. And
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to change it for anything in the world. Like I like the way it is. Like those movie posters are amazing. Like I love them. So yeah,
yeah.
I get that, but I know it's not for everyone.
No, no,
For
no,
sure.
no. And that again was Kan also was drawn by Tamaha, who liked lots of the stuff that she drew, but not the front cover because she found it very difficult to draw humans.
Yeah.
So she actually didn't want us to use it, but we had to print the game, so that was what we had. And that
Uh,
was Con and the original Bus were made at a time when we were students and we had very low volumes, and we could absolutely not afford anyone to do any artistry on it. So Tamaha was a partner and a co-founder of Splotter, and so she did all the drawings at the time.
I think in the end it looks great. Like
Yeah.
I think going back to focus on Indonesia. So Indonesia is, as you said, you're mostly interested in economic strategy game, but Indonesia is not in a vacuum. The game has an historical context, and I
Mhm.
guess we could say it's like the period of Dutch East Indies. The moment where you have the how is it called this like VOC, it's East Indies
Mhm.
company.
The VOC, the VOC, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering, can you maybe provide a bit of historical context around the game of Indonesia? Because I was looking at the rule book, and the only direct historical mention that you have in there is the Sultan of Solo, which
Yeah.
is a very specific moment in time. So you can say, okay, it's within that moment in time. So you can figure out. But apart from this, there is nothing. So I was
No,
wondering, can you
no.
maybe,
So it is in that sense because I've looked at your podcast on colonialism, and I saw that we were also mentioned in the book of Mary something, the professor that you interviewed,
yeah, Mary Flanagan. Yeah.
as being an exotic game. So maybe in the spirit of this way of analyzing, let me also go back a little bit into my own history and why this is a game about Indonesia. So Indonesia is not a very exotic country for me. I grew up in Indonesia. I lived there from when I was 6 till when I was 12, and it is a country that I know well, that I have traveled really a lot. I also speak some Indonesian, not amazingly good, but at the level of a child. So I can sing children's song in Indonesia, and I can recite the official state philosophy of Pancasila because I had to learn it at school, and I can sing the Indonesian anthem, etc., etc. So it is a game that is a topic that feels quite close to to how I've lived. That's not true for Jeroen. Jeroen has never been there. The game was also thought up in Indonesia, and the original idea was to make a kind of Britannia, but then in Indonesia, so that because Britannia is a game where you have all these people coming into the country and conquering it. And my idea was to make something like that in Indonesia, and it was thought up in an airport where Tma and I had to wait for a long time because our flight was delayed at the end of a long trip in Indonesia, and I was super annoyed because we had to go home, and then and we were sitting there for the 12 hours, and then Tma said, "Why don't you think of a new game idea?" And that was the original moment of thinking about Indonesia. Now, as to the historical context, there is a very conscious element in Indonesia, which perhaps is a bit odd, but there are no colonials in Indonesia. There's no Dutch influence. Nothing is exported, nothing is brought out. And that is a conscious decision because I studied history in Leiden, where your podcast is called Homo Ludens, after our Lector Magnificus Huizinga. So I studied this in Leiden, and at some point I wanted to study Indonesian history because I grew up there, and I went to the Department of Indonesian History, which Leiden is famous for. And it turned out that the Department of Indonesian History at the time, in the 1990s, only taught colonial history. So the whole history of Indonesia started with colonial history, which I found disappointing because the colonial history I was not so interested in. I was much more interested in what happened before all of that. And so when we made Indonesia, we considered having companies or elements or things come in from the outside and exports moving there. We considered having, for instance, a map with the old East Indies or the pre-Dutch countries on it, and we chose not to have any of that in. So it is set in a kind of strange world where Indonesia does produce all of the goods that were relevant for the colonial government, like spices and rubber and oil, maybe towards the end of the colonial period. But everything is moved internally, only to internal cities, and the internal cities are growing. So it is in that sense a made-up period in which colonization did not really happen.
So it's more alternative history than
it is, in a way, and some of that is if you are in the. So I because having lived in Indonesia, I have a lot of friends who've also lived in Indonesia or have Indonesian roots somehow in Dutch society. Dutch society has a very interesting or strange, maybe, relationship with its old colonial history, and this is driven for a large part because when Indonesia became independent, a lot of people moved from Indonesia to the Netherlands, and those were the Dutch people who worked in the colonial government, but also a lot of Indonesians who had worked in the colonial government, and a lot of people who had both Indonesian and Dutch ancestry. And also, in later stages, a lot of Christian Indonesians who did not want to, or were not allowed to, live their lives in the way that they wanted in the new republic, because there's been quite some purges and troubles in Indonesia in the first 30 years of its existence.
bagus. Cuman jangan lama kali nangis ya.
Born free as
Action.
free as
Itu definisi kejahatan perang. Itu buatan orang yang menang. Saya pemenang.
And these people have been very vocal in Dutch society as being mostly being quite anti-Indonesia. So you have this strange situation that people who look Indonesian in Dutch society, at least maybe not now, but in the past 50 years, have been quite have been very critical of the Indonesian government. If you look at our super far right politician, Mr. Wilders, that's
Yeah.
actually an Indonesian guy. He is of Indonesian descent. And one of the reasons he is so super afraid of Islam is because his ancestors were living in the Moluccans and a Christian area of Indonesia where he was, which was quite forcibly made more Islamic. So we have a very odd, discussion here, and Indonesia in a way takes a very subtle maybe a statement in this, in that the names of all the places are the names of the current Indonesian governments gives them, or rather the government at the time, because they changed a little bit, because all the areas are the current Indonesian provinces. They are not the Dutch names or the pre-colonial names or the names of you can argue that some of the areas should be named differently, and that would perhaps not now, but 30-40 years ago there would still be people thinking that those should not be the correct names. So also there is a kind of, yeah, it is a kind of alternate history in which the Indonesian state already existed long before.
So it's pre-colonial, but still with some components of post-colonial history, because
Yeah,
it is.
it kind of follows some kind of non-existent history in which the Indonesian state as it is today existed 200-300 years earlier, and was growing in the way that the Indonesian state would grow without any of the colonial impact or steps in it.
Mhm.
So
And
yeah, it's odd.
yeah, and I think there is also another bit of alternative history that I was curious, that I was thinking about when I was listening to you about the, like, putting together the pieces of this alternate Indonesia, is, I guess, also the economical system, because the game is, I would say, highly, like, it's classic capitalism, where you have concentration of capital, you have mergers,
Yeah.
you have for efficiency, and trying to actually create monopolistic situations on the board.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I guess that's probably not, and I'm not sure that would be actually also a question, not necessarily the economical system that you could see in pre-colonial Indonesia. What, like, you did come up with probably also the economical system that came with the settlers. So is this also something that is part of that reflection, or?
I don't think it does not represent or does not correspond with the economical system that comes with the settlers. I don't think there were some settlers, but it's the situation in Indonesia is more one in which there is an extraction by a group of people who there's very few people. There's some people who went there to stay, but it's not really like South Africa or the US or Australia, where the Dutch sent lots of settlers to live there. The country was also very,
Yeah.
very
But I
crowded.
mean, what I mean is that the economical system looks a lot like the economical system that came from that came from the Dutch. So the one that you are seeing in the game, the companies, the way they work.
I don't know that that's true, because the Dutch came in with one big the Dutch came in with the East Indies Company. So originally it was not the Dutch government, but the East Indies Company who worked there. That was one monopoly from the beginning. So they arranged that no one else could go in. So there were no multiple companies and mergers and all this stuff did not happen. And the Indonesia starts with rice and moving around rice. That is not something that the Dutch said the Dutch economy was interested in. The spices, yes. So the spices are important in Indonesia as a good, and that was always an export good before the Dutch were there. It would be exported, but not at the same scale, and not so the fact that that is produced, yes. And rubber is also, of course, a later good that is really a good that was extracted and used for industrial purposes outside of Indonesia. The capitalist production system that is there, I think, is not at all historical in the way that it takes companies that can be founded and that can be rather freely founded, that can be merged, that just something we made up from a much later period of capitalist society. It does not reflect the colonial way of doing business either, and also not the original Indonesian way of doing business. This was just a game mechanism that is much more linked to later capitalist workings.
So it's clearly more of a game design influence than a statement or anything.
Yeah. So in general, I think we make our games mostly as games. I think. I mean, I've studied history, and I come from a long line of people, a long family of people having deep interest in all kinds of societal issues, albeit with vastly different conclusions sometimes. So I will mostly be sensitive to some of the choices or decisions that are there, but this idea of mergers and stuff has not been made to represent anything specifically in the game, and I do not think it is very settler-like, or settlers is a strange word, but I don't think it is very. It very much represents either the colonial or the or the pre-colonial or even the post-colonial world. It represents a very modern world of buying and selling companies as a kind of private equity type of situation, which is something I also find interesting and have seen and worked a lot with, which was kind of pushed in this game because it felt like it worked very well.
And maybe just to generalize a bit more, if I'm looking at your work more globally and the way history is implemented in this game, I was thinking about Antiquity, for example, where you're probably somewhere in Italy, that you are probably sometime in the Middle Ages, but you don't have any clear, explicit historical references, but still you feel like you're playing in history. And I think it's the same with Horseless Carriage. Maybe Horseless Carriage is more focused on a specific moment in time, like the emergence of the car. I'm wondering, like, looking at this, how does history integrate in your work? Because you do not have explicit references, but it's still a pretty important background. I think it's the same also for the Great Zimbabwe. It's not a specific moment in time, but you're looking at a moment that is before colonialism. So you look at a moment that is still identifiable.
Yeah.
Same for Antiquity. So how do you integrate this reflection into your game design process? Do you use it mostly for inspiration, or is it reflective of something that you were exploring at the time that you were actually designing the game? How does those topics come into the design?
In the case of Indonesia and Antiquity, those were topics that were there from the very beginning. In Zimbabwe, it was we made the theme a little bit later on. About halfway through. So normally, yes, what we are inspired by a theme, or we take such a theme to give a flavor and to build the situation in a nice way. There are I do read then normally a lot about problems in this time, or things about the history of a period, but we do not try to simulate. I do not find historical simulation games to be very interesting, and the reason for that is that I like the game mechanisms more than I like reliving history. So it is never our objective to make something that is very specific in a specific time, or a specific that follows something that happens, because if you want to do so, then you very quickly come up with very specific things that should happen, or that you get stuff where you need to have events, and I don't like that type of direction in games. And as a result, you very often end up with a world that is sort of, I think it is often a little bit more close to the theme than some of the very traditional Euro games, where you can have a game like, let's say, Java, which is also about Indonesia, but it could just as well be about any other place in the world. It would take about an artist about a week to make that a game about a completely different topic. And I think Indonesia is a little bit more close to the area, but you could make it about something else, of course. And I think that is the same with Zimbabwe or Antiquity. There's a lot of the spirit of a period or an area or a culture goes into this game, but it doesn't try to simulate it. It's kind of in a different world.
What you just said made me reflect on a game that I think has a close thematic connection with your game, but that approaches radically differently. It's called Werel's John Company. I don't know if you've played John Company.
I haven't played it, no.
Because it has some similarities. It's also a pretty heavy economical game, especially if you play with the private companies. It has a bit of a competitive cooperative 18xx feel to it, especially in the advanced game. And in the same way, it's trying to focus more on the system and the design experience. I don't think that it's necessarily it's not because my pushback would be, it's not because you make a historical game that you have to design for effect, so that you have to design for specific events to happen in a specific time. I think a lot of historical designers do that, and I think often it reflects a vision of history that is a bit more on rails and a bit less focused on history as a system, like understanding what are the conditions that made the events what they made. And I think this is something that Core World does pretty well in John Company. It gives the players in a situation, it gives them a system to operate in, and within that system, they naturally come up with this concept of, well, trading with India is good, but what would be really cool is that if we started to have political control over certain areas. And I really like this idea of putting players in a specific situation, and they end up understanding the rationality of the actors of the time and why they made the decision that they made. And not necessarily, of course, you have a certain distance. So if you're close to that story, like if you feel like you have a moral dilemma, but if you look at it just as a system, you're like, well, naturally that my incentive is there
is to do that.
So
I think our games can sometimes do that, but they do that more not on the level of history, but on the level of a capitalist society. Because if you look at where we actually simulate for real, we simulate business and business decisions. So I once had the opportunity to play Indonesia with a bunch of the guys who are in the board of one of the biggest Dutch companies, because I worked with them, and they said, hey, you design games, let's play one of your games once. And these guys are good at mergers and acquisitions, so I played Indonesia with them. And they won handily, even if it was the first time that they ever played, because they're just super good at understanding this mechanism of mergers and acquisitions. And the same way, I played Greed once against a bunch of traders, and it was one of the most interesting gaming experiences I had, because you can really do some trading deals in greed that I had never thought of, and these traders came up with it like in 10 minutes after starting the game. They started making deals that I've never seen any gamer ever make. I think that idea of putting people into a system and then seeing the consequences of that system and being able to understand your actions is very much a part of many Splotter games, but it is on the economic side and not so much on the historical side.
Yeah, and I think also Food Chain Magnate is really good at doing
Yeah.
this. Like the idea that you're going to dump a product for a cheaper price just to cut off the competition. This idea of concentrating some goods in specific areas rather than trying to cover everything, just because you know that the demand is going to be concentrated in a specific time, and you just have to undersell compared to your competitors. You have a lot of this in those kind of games. So you do, and that's what I find fascinating about specifically your heavy economical games, is that you show economy as a system, like the economical systems, and it represents well the dynamic that you might have in a competitive market like this. So it's actually interesting that you're playing with people who do mergers and acquisition. I guess that makes a lot of sense. That they would be good at this.
I spend a lot of my time. I make games for fun. I spend most of my time doing running another business, and I spend a lot of time doing consulting in big businesses. So I have a lot of business. I see business from very up close. So that's also where I think a lot of the inspiration comes from. And sometimes, and if I have moral opinions or dilemmas, they are mostly about how businesses function in today's society, rather than projecting things on historical periods, where you can also find those, of course, but with the exception maybe of Antiquity, which was really made out of reading a book on environmental problems in actually Antiquity, so an earlier period. And I thought it would be nice to make a resource-based game where you actually have the problem that resources run out, and what do you do if that happens.
Yeah,
That's
and you have
the
this
idea from that game.
You have this whole waste management in Antiquity that is so good, but so mean. But
it's super mean. Yeah, but that's you can destroy the world. That's what the game is about, and that's because that was the original idea of the game. Let's make a game where you produce stuff, where you can.
It's actually a pretty strong political statement. So in a way, like Antiquity, in an indirect way, has this idea that you have to manage your resources, you have to manage waste, and if you don't pay attention, you might destroy the world. Like, is it something that it's not something that you see in a lot of your games? Why do you think this one is maybe has a bit more profound political statement to it?
I was fascinated by reading on the history of environmental problems and how old they are, and I thought this would be nice to make a game out of this, because people don't realize that how much deforestation happened because people wanted to have ships in the Roman age already, and then the English were also always busy trying to find masts for their ships, getting the right pine trees to put and cutting down forests everywhere to do this. I thought it was an interesting idea, because it is something you don't really realize. People think that environmental problems start with the
modern era,
Industrial Revolution or something, but no, we've been destroying the world for a long time.
Yes, we've been doing that a lot. But I also like this idea of waste management, something that we don't think about, but like humans generate a lot of waste, and we often overlook, even in history and in a lot of aspects of studying human societies, how we manage waste. And I think even today, a lot of people don't understand what is happening with our trash. And how and I think it's a massive part of what human society is managing trash, managing human waste. And I think it's actually something that is quite beautiful. It says a lot about the societies that we live in, the way we manage our trash. So I think that's one of the reasons I always liked Antiquity, is putting this in the middle of the game and making it a central and extremely mean game mechanic was very inspiring. People should think about the trash. that's for sure.
I think thinking about this and recycling where possible, and understanding where things go, but also understanding that you do not always need all of those things. That can be that can bring a contribution to what people do. Yes.
And I had maybe one last question on Indonesia, and that's regarding the fact that you grew up there, and from what you said earlier in the interview, you still go there from time to time. And I was wondering, was the game played over there? Did you have some reaction of local players and everything? And how can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, I don't have too many, but I have one friend whom I met in Essen, Eco Negro, and he actually makes a lot of games about. He's a board game designer and also a teacher in Indonesia. And he told me that he starts his lectures by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen and students, my class is about making games. My goal is that in 5 or 10 years' time, the best game about Indonesia will not be made by a Dutch colonizer." Because this
I
is
think that's
the Dutch game about Indonesia. And in fact, I think this is something quite interesting. I played a lot of his. He used to come to Essen with a group of Indonesian designers, and they had lots of smaller games, which were quite fascinating because they have very unique mechanisms. So I like them a lot. And it was very hard for this group of Indonesian designers to break through in the more international world. They were also working on a historical game called Freedom in Indonesia, Merdeka. That would be, I don't know. I before this, I looked it up because I wanted. He promised that I could play it once it was there, but I've never seen it for real. So I don't know what happened with it. But they made some games about the Indonesian decolonization, actual historical games from an Indonesian perspective, which I think would be interesting to play and to see.
Well, if you hear back from them and the game is released, historical games is the bread and butter of this channel,
Yeah.
and decolonization is a topic that I'm really interested in too. And there are some really interesting games that have been released in the past decade, specifically on this. So I would be very keen on having them on the show and talk about the game. So that would be great. So keep me posted if you hear anything. And maybe now I would like just maybe to open up the discussion to your work more generally. So you have this second printing of Indonesia that is coming up, but are you currently working on new projects for Splotter? What is the future ahead for the company?
Yes, we are working on. So there is now going to print a new version, or just a straight reprint of Food Chain and Ketchup. But that's not super exciting. It's just exactly the same reprint for people who don't have it yet. We are the Indonesia reprint is almost done. We are working on a new game, but I think it will not be there until 2025. We've just been playtesting it even yesterday. So that is in its first playtesting phase, in which we still play it only with a small group of people that we know very well. We always work on only one game at a time. I cannot.
And
So
you
I
can,
know some designers, they have like 20 designs that they work on
yeah.
at the same time. I don't know how you can do that. It's not possible in my head.
Can you tell us anything about the topic yet, or it's too early?
No, it's too early. I've promised you not to tell anything.
Good to know. I guess. Oh, there is something that I wanted to talk to you about. There is going to be a new edition of Ur 1830 BC. Yeah, and it's so. I was wondering about this one, so I pre-ordered it. I like the 18xx game, and I was like, well, the Splotter take on 18xx, set in a specific moment in time that I have a particular interest in, is like ticking all of my boxes. So I'm pretty excited about it. When I receive it, do you still feel comfortable enough for teaching the game, or it's too far away and you don't remember the rules, or? would you be interested in coming in for doing a teach and play?
Yeah, maybe that could work, or maybe Johan could do that, because Johan is normally better at teaching than I am. But let's have a look when it is there. I'm very comfortable teaching it still. So we could do something like this.
Yeah, that would be great. And it's another good example of direct historical context, but not like somewhat abstracted. So I'm curious actually about playing it, because I guess there are things that can be said about expansion of empires that don't really have the administrative capability of being so big and collapsing on their own weight. So I'm wondering if there is some of it in the game or not.
That would be a super interesting topic. I actually published articles on that when I was studying history, on the speed at which different elements move, so military elements, trade elements, information elements, and the relative size of different types of economic and military and political organizations, depending on how far you can get. And that would be a super interesting topic to make a game about. Is not that.
No, okay, good. Because I think it's a really interesting topic, especially in that era where you feel like there was some physical constraint for having such a complex human organization, and you feel like you have this phase of expansion, especially during the Assyrian period, where it became really large, but it couldn't be sustained because of the distances, but also the ways of communication were a bit too limited. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. So
there's a super interesting book about Charlemagne in my period of that I mostly studied is the medieval period, so I know a little bit more about it. But about Charlemagne and about all the letters and missives that he got, and what he was informed about and what not, and what he could do himself and what not. Really looking at this mythological figure, of course, also, but this ruler of an enormous empire as a person who needed to organize as a manager almost, decide who to speak to and who not, and what information he got and what he could use to make his decisions, and what would be his limitations. And I think looking at understanding the power of an organization or power of a country like that is super interesting, because there are great limits to what you can and cannot govern, and there is definitely a game in there. But
yeah, I really think there is I think there is something interesting, but yeah, I will end the discussion here, and so we can each respectively start thinking about this. But I would like the reference of that book on Charlemagne, because I think there is definitely something interesting in there.
Yeah.
But it was great chatting with you, Joris. Really appreciate you taking the time. When the new edition of Indonesia is here, I would also be very keen on having both of you on the show to actually talk about the new version and maybe do a teach and play. When Ur is out, you need to come. I think that's going to be really fun. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this 2025 game that you will announce more information on soon. But thanks again for all the context. Soonish. For me, like if it's in a year, it's soon. Like it's
maybe this year. Yes, maybe somewhere this year. Yeah. If all goes well. Sometimes we completely abandon a project, but so far I'm very happy about how it goes. So, and I think it's very unique. So,
well, yeah, most of your games are. So I would expect that much. But yeah, thanks for taking the time, and see you soon.